If your organization is ready to embrace edge computing, we have good news. The 2023 AT&T Cybersecurity Insights Report provides everything you need to know to get started. In the report, we identify the common characteristics of edge computing. We found edge use cases are rapidly coming online, and we reveal how to secure edge computing. Most importantly, you'll learn how to prepare for your edge ecosystem. Get your complimentary copy of the report today. Visit securityweekly.com/ATT cybersecurity. That's securityweekly.com/ATT cybersecurity. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Follow us on Twitter for live stream reminders, highlighted clips, memes, and more. You can find us at SEC Weekly, SEC Weekly. All right, for our second interview today, Kelly Shortridge joins us to talk about chaos, failure, and why InfoSec continues to struggle. Kelly Shortridge is a senior principal in the office of the CTO at Fastly. She's a prolific writer and speaker in security with dozens, if not hundreds, of interesting essays and talks to her name that you can go check out either on her website or on YouTube somewhere. She's an expert on resilience in complex software systems, which is kind of at the core of a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. And also wrote a very thought-provoking book on resilience called Security Chaos Engineering, which is also going to work its way into our conversation today. Welcome to the show, Kelly.
Thank you for having me, Adrian. Always a pleasure.
Likewise. I didn't even mention decision trees. Maybe we'll get to that as well. You do, and we were talking about this in the prep call. I'm just impressed with both your output, the quality of the output and the quantity. And I wish I could do half the number of things that you're doing.
As I joke, I'm a total hermit. Like, what's fun for me is like digging into like 500 academic research papers over a weekend, and then coming up with a bunch of ideas coming out of that, which could be anywhere from like 5 to 10 blog posts or a book. Or a like 140,000 word book. So.
Yeah. And you seem to, which I think I can really, it's similar for me, just taking these ideas, throwing them out there and getting feedback on them. So do you enjoy that process as well? Just the process of, hey, here's an idea, after reading those, however many research papers, putting together a blog post, putting it out there. You're really eager to see what comes back from some of that or from some of your talks?
For sure. I mean, I love inspiring people. I've been incredibly flattered and honored that I've heard some organizations actually base a lot of their security strategy on my work, even going back to like 2017 with behavioral game theory stuff. And that's obviously extremely fulfilling. I think there are a lot of my more philosophical essays and content that gets people thinking in new ways. And they say that they completely change their perspective and their mindset. And that's also very rewarding. But to be honest, a lot of what I do is just for my own amusement in a very like Vonnegut sense. Like I recently published an essay that's quite long on the etymology of the word security and what it can tell us about modern security. I didn't really expect people to read like a 30-minute essay for the most part. Like people, have stuff to do. But I had a blast researching it and writing it. I even wrote like a Socratic dialogue. So it's a mixture of like, I actually want to influence things for the better. Like everybody is struggling across software engineering and cybersecurity with resilience and security challenges. Like, how can I make kind of this indelible mark on the industry and make the world better in my own way? Then the other part of it is definitely like just how to have fun with life, right?
Right. And reading your writing is you can tell you're having fun with it, because the reader has fun with it also. And there's this art that you embrace. I've seen a few people embrace the art of the footnote, where you can just go down this whole rabbit hole with the footnotes on some of your posts. And it's a lot of fun that you take the time to include all that stuff.
Well, I'm an avid footnote reader, so I like to view it as like little Easter eggs, like a reward for you being a fellow footnote reader, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, it's interesting. Some of the things you noted there, like changing how we think. Security has a lot of baggage. A lot of security kind of grew out of technical roles. And it's interesting. As we evolved, I used to say years ago that the whole agile DevOps movement did more for security than any actual security people ever did. just by changing kind of the table stakes, changing the the kind of the different pieces of the formula that we have to work with. Like all of a sudden, if a workflow can be ephemeral, like that just changes the whole game. Which is something that would have never occurred to somebody thinking purely in security terms. But yeah, we kind of come with a lot of baggage. So I'm kind of curious. I just want to touch a little bit on because your background is in finance. And I want to touch on some of your impressions as you came into security at the time that you did. I don't know if it just
Yeah, so my original background is more like behavioral economics as far as what I studied in school, which is all about how humans make decisions and especially the supposed rationality of those decisions. I think rationality is a fraught term. We can get into that if you want. But what I definitely noticed is that there was a lot of market inefficiencies. There was a lot of very confusing dynamics. It was very clearly not really based on ROI. It was a lot more like feels than reals. To speak, there was a lot of herding behavior. There's a lot of, like chasing the shiny because it makes you feel cool and important. Obviously, the social dynamics between software engineers and cybersecurity teams, or software engineering teams and cybersecurity teams. I noticed a lot of resentment kind of in the cybersecurity world at the time. It was cybersecurity leaders like CISOs being like, the cloud is dangerous. Like, I can secure my servers better than Amazon, which I think everybody now realizes is a joke. But I was there and I remember that was the majority opinion in cybersecurity. And obviously they lost that battle. And I think it's good that they did. So that was kind of the world I went into where I was like, wow, this industry's a mess. I think I can actually make a difference, which was a bit naive. But I feel like eventually I kind of got there, at least how companies kind of rely on my expertise now. But it started out with pointing out kind of those biases, especially around prospect theory, where losses feel harder than gains for humans. They feel like twice as bad as gains, and just showing that you can almost see almost like the gambler's fallacy of like, oh, I need to get out of the hole once I've lost a lot of money, so I have to make bigger bets almost. You get desperate, and showing how that translated into cybersecurity. That was kind of the start of things. And since then, I did a lot of like, here's the problem space. And I had people rightfully being like, okay, so what do we do instead? And I would talk about that kind of piecemeal. But the book is basically a culmination of people who are like, well, what do we do instead? Okay, so our strategy's bad in theory, Kelly, like you're kind of like crapping all over it. Fine. What should we do? And the book is basically my like, here's what you do. Like, here's a bunch of things to think about, a bunch of like opportunities and practices. So we'll see, again, in some sense, software engineering teams are more excited about some of this stuff than cybersecurity teams. See the prior history with CISOs being fearful of the cloud and fearful of change. But I think, the way forward, like you said, is not with what we know today. A lot of it is not going to be found in a vendor hall or in a bolt-on tool, certainly not in like AI or LLMs. A lot of it is just like adopting, like you said, DevOps practices and other technologies that enable like reliability benefits that also have these ancillary cybersecurity benefits. But you have to have a more open mind. And that's a lot of what I try to do is like, how do we open the industry's mind to these new opportunities?
Well, you know what they say, the cloud is just someone else's computer, man, right? Like those stickers still exist on people's laptops. Yeah. But it's astounding to me, some of the stuff we've seen in the last couple of years, like, an entire exchange hosting business going out the window. All in a matter of weeks, because even a company that specialized in hosting Microsoft Exchange servers still couldn't do it well enough to not have the entire thing disrupted. But it's and I wonder how much people are pointing their finger at Microsoft's the never-ending train of Azure issues, as evidence for why they should run their own stuff. And then we've got some almost regressive stuff where Basecamp is quitting the cloud and
that's because well, I mean, there's a very obvious self-interest there, right? Right. Like Ruby on Rails kind of thrives on things not being cloud, so it makes sense. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah. There's a bias.
Well, I'm sure they're saving some money, but the other side of that is they never went pure cloud anyway, so they never kind of lost the skill set of running their own stuff. So yeah, sure, fine, maybe that works for them because they're only using 3 or 4 Amazon services. They don't have large Lambda workloads, I imagine. Like some of that stuff, like it's not even comparable anymore. A lot of the services that exist in cloud. I'm not sure there are on-prem equivalents or, at what scale it makes sense to even attempt that.
Yeah, I think Oxide is a new one that gives kind of the equivalent of like on-prem, but still with your cloud kind of dev workflows. Big fan of what they've been doing there. I feel like things ping pong sometimes. I personally think the Basecamp thing is kind of an isolated incident. It's a fight probably that he'll lose, to be honest. The thing is, like, hybrid, I think is the most likely, especially for large organizations. But for small organizations, cloud just makes sense. Like, don't hire, like, you have some sort of business, and that business is not managing servers, right? And so if you want to succeed in your business and differentiate in your market, whatever capital you have to spend on headcount, like, you should dedicate that to whatever expertise makes sense for your business and outsource, the hard thinky things to the people who are experts, right? So I think Basecamp is maybe an exception in that regard, but certainly your typical, retail company or basically any other industry other than tech, I think it's not feasible to move back away from the cloud. I do think the shift away from microservices, that's kind of a different trend. And I personally think that's because what people ultimately wanted to achieve with microservices was modularity. But it's pretty easy to not get modularity with microservices, and you just get kind of like a complexity spaghetti mess, which isn't great. And you have higher overhead costs in terms of like network transport. So there are definitely downsides there. So I can understand the moving back, trying to adopt a modular monolith more than moving away from cloud. And it's not something I'm even seeing. If anything, I'm just seeing more and more cloud adoption. So.
Yeah, and kind of going back to my example of DevOps doing more for security than I think we ever have directly. Resilience is a big piece of that. I've been in charge of disaster recovery and business continuity before, and I've seen just old school plans where we're going to recover databases from tapes, and then all the way into high availability. What it looked like in the old school, what it looked like in the new school. I worked with clients that actually threw the switch for 1 week, and this was a retail company, to their DR environment, ran off of DR for 1 week every quarter, and then threw the switch back. And that was in the old school way of doing things. That was the most impressive case I've ever seen, but it's the only one I know of. And it's the only time I ever saw it. So that seemed much more the exception than the rule. In most cases, people have no idea what would happen if they had to use their DR plan until it happens. And of course, what I used to tell people is maybe you've gotten 50% of it right. The other 50% of what's going to go wrong, you're going to find out at the moment you throw that switch.
Absolutely, yeah. The rule of complex systems and of just like life. The universe is to expect the unexpected. There are going to be surprises. We can never hope to mentally model the system completely. There are too many variables. It's just impossible. So yeah, that's something where, again, when I talk a lot about resilience, in some sense, there's the most receptive audience is actually SREs, site reliability engineers, because like you said, they're very focused on, just laser focused on things like availability, or what I would call reliability in general, which is, to me, is made up of performance, availability, and correctness. Like, does the service work as intended? And so they're very laser focused on those things, which naturally means they're already doing a lot of things for resilience that also helps with cybersecurity. And they love hearing like, oh, we just have to think maybe a little differently or extend things in a particular way to cover, things like denial of service attacks. And certainly if you think about correctness in terms of, again, is a system or service behaving as intended? If an attacker is abusing an API, that's obviously not as intended, right? So you can see how their mandate could encompass cybersecurity. And they are so clever. All of my SRE friends, I'm always just amazed like how like MacGyver-y they are with systems. It's fantastic. And they also often care a lot about observability in a way that I think cybersecurity has not been able to catch up to be perfectly honest. Their data pipelines seem to be, even if messy, a bit stronger. And what I also see is there's often duplicate work between what like an SRE team or a platform engineering team is doing for observability, and what like a cybersecurity team is doing. But overwhelmingly, the platform engineering team is trying to build in resilience into the system, and they aren't quite as partial to like the bolts-on tools. Whereas the cybersecurity team, when I like consult or advise and just like talk to these companies, a lot of times the cybersecurity team is looking still for kind of that silver bullet, like what's going to be the perfect thing to defend us against all the things, right? And they've maybe ignored a lot of the like being able to change the system quickly, like being able to patch on demand, right? They've ignored being able, again, to like make sure, yeah, your logs are up and healthy and they aren't full of a bunch of BS, right? They're turning into like actionable metrics, or ignoring like, hey, like you said, maybe we can have more ephemeral services or immutable services that mean that the attacker just like can't persist. They can't, gain a shell on the system. Like there are all these things that, again, software engineers are already doing for reliability that often cybersecurity teams just don't know. And even sometimes when they're told, so this is getting to be a rambly answer, but I think it's important. I gave the same talk at Black Hat USA in 2019 as I did at Velocity, which was O'Reilly's conference around software engineering and platform engineering, especially in Berlin later that year in 2019. And Dr. Forsgren, who presented with me, Black Hat, can attest to this. There were people who apparently like walked out because they were so angry. We had such an angry Q&A after the Black Hat one. People were still at that time saying like the cloud is terrible for security. And they were very offended by the idea that security should adopt like DevOps principles and practices and, cooperate more and things like secure by design that I was talking about. At Velocity with, again, more SREs, software engineers, platform engineers, they loved it. They were like, oh my gosh, I now understand how like I can help cybersecurity. Like I can make a difference here. The attitude difference was it was miles apart. And I think, unfortunately, that's indicative of where we've seen things since 2019 headed, which is platform engineering slowly starting to eat more of the software security problem and cybersecurity teams increasingly getting cut out of that process.
This is all so interesting. And some of the things that you're saying have got me thinking about some things I've wondered, but maybe not have said out loud for a really long time, which is how security comes at security. I think, and you can tell me if you agree with this, and then tell me how you would tackle this problem if you're addressing the market in a talk, in a book. But I think part of the issue with security is that security people love to operate in a little bit of a black box, right? Because there's sort of that, behind the curtain kind of attitude that helps security feel, no pun intended, more secure in their jobs. If people don't really understand what's going on, and if they're the ones who can hold the answers, that gives them more job security, that makes them not have to go too far outside of what they're doing. And I don't think anybody's doing it to be selfish. I just think that this is security. We don't necessarily either want, or people don't understand what we're doing. And therefore that shift holds a lot of security people back, whereas developers, engineers are more focused on what they need to do the next day, the next week, the next month. And with your psychology, behavioral background, is that something you see and something that the mindset, the chaos mindset helps when you're talking to, for instance, SREs versus security people who might want to walk out of a talk? Is it something that people should be thinking of, or am I totally off base and have just insulted a whole lot of people?
No, I mean, people are going to be insulted, right? That's my like lived experience for my whole career is people are very angry, even if I'm like, listen, this is not something I even think you're consciously doing. Because a lot of it is like humans subconsciously, like you said, like they want to protect themselves. They want to protect their livelihoods. Like there's psychological insecurity is a real thing, right? There's a reason why for corporate culture, everybody tries to aspire to psychological safety because that produces far better outcomes. And I think there is a very strong selection bias, especially with kind of like the old guard, shall we say, in cybersecurity, the ones that are currently at the leadership tier because they've risen up through the ranks, right, for many, many years. I think there is a selection bias where it takes a particular type of person, definitely back in the day, to think about what could go wrong, right? There's a kind of hypervigilance that you need to have, which frankly, hypervigilance is just terrible for human nervous systems, and that accumulates over time. I think it is not an accident that we have like just probably way too many whiskey tastings and alcohol related things at these conferences, right? In a way that you don't see in other areas of tech. I'm just going to point that out there. I think there is kind of, in some sense, especially when I talk to security leaders, like I can empathize because there is a kind of just very defeatist mindset and a very, like you said, insular, very insecure mindset of like almost like they're worried they're going to be found out for being a fraud. And the SEC case pending notwithstanding, I think part of the problem is that the security industry, to be frank, has gotten away with not proving outcomes. You know, things like time to detect doesn't matter. That doesn't tell you anything about the system recovering or the impact to the business. Certainly things like percent of risk coverage, like that's meaningless. Reporting metrics like that, it's kind of not a wonder to me that we're often treated like a joke as an industry, again, being very honest. And sometimes you hear, well, we're trying to prove counterfactuals that we prevented something. It's not all that different to what SREs face, right? On the reliability side, they're trying to prevent downtime. And so there are a bunch of metrics that we can actually steal. I suggest a bunch in my book. Even some of the system signals we can steal from the SRE side. They should be our peers because we're both, again, fighting that battle of like, we're trying to prevent or ideally recover from better some sort of bad thing happening in our systems, right? There should be that kinship, but yeah, you see very different cultures. And I think it's a problem. And I personally think there's a certain inflection point where the people with the more constructive mindset of like, you know what, failure will happen, but we can prepare for it. We can make sure that we recover, can make sure that we minimize impact. You know, we want to be builders. We want to make things easy for the employees in our organization, our users, the developers in our organization, make the secure way the easy way. There's that mindset. And then there's the mindset of like, you know, I am someone who implements tools and I kind of have my empire and, you know, I get to feel special by being on the advisory board of a bunch of different startups doing things. And, you know, I don't have to really report success metrics because it's too hard. I don't actually think it's too hard. I think there's, again, there's kind of a collective like learned helplessness, and I think we can do better. And again, sometimes people get insulted by that, but to me, I'm actually saying like, I think you are capable of more. I think we as an industry are capable of much more. The question is, will we rise to the occasion? That's my very spicy / inspirational take on it.
No, I think that's great. And, you know, the $10,000 or $10 million question is, do you think as an industry we can get out of this groupthink attitude or this echo chamber of, oh gosh, we're up against everybody else. We've got this really hard thing to do. Because, you know, I've certainly seen it over the past 10, 15 or so years. It's very much this, oh, we're all in this together, but we're all in it as security alone. Is there some way to try to overcome it? I mean, obviously people like you are out there talking about it, but are there certain things that security people can embrace to actually change the mindset? Because it's the mindset. It's not the actual tools and technologies.
Yeah, definitely. I think a big thing is to start attending reliability conferences. That's like a very simple one. Like check out, you know, KubeCon's happening this week. I spoke there on Monday at the WebAssembly Day. Like just go see some of the talks there, especially the ones relating to like reliability, resilience, and start to brainstorm like, hey, you know what? We have a lot in common. They get burned out. They have to deal with incidents too, right? They have to be on call. Finding that kind of like mutual struggle, I think, is really valuable. I do see, like you said, a lot of times it is insular where, you know, the first time I saw a reference to infrastructure as code, other than when I talked about it, it's kind of like benefits to security. The only other time I saw it was that infrastructure as code, like shadow infrastructure as code, and how it's going to be so damaging to organization. Attackers are going to be all up in it. It's like, okay, but when I talked to some of the people espousing that, they couldn't tell me what infrastructure as code actually was, right? And I think one thing we're supposed to pride ourselves on in cybersecurity is being curious. I think we need to lean into that. We need to be curious about other team struggles. We need to be curious about the technologies they're using. Like an example I commonly give is like queues and message brokers can be amazing if there's a cybersecurity incident, because you can take a service offline, patch it up, redeploy it without disrupting the actual system operation. which is a really beautiful thing. But a lot of times security people don't know about message brokers and queues, but that's something they would learn very quickly. Again, kind of reaching out, learning more from that other area. I think there's a way, if you allocate maybe 10% less of your time on like, here's the new shiny vulnerability or like this new APT report, how much is that actually helping your day-to-day, right? How is that actually helping your job other than that kind of FOMO and feeling like, oh, I'm in the know, therefore I'm doing stuff. It's like, well, is it actionable? Not really, for the most part. So allocate that 10% towards learning about these other things. Checking out some of the like platform engineering thought leaders and seeing what they're saying. They're on LinkedIn too, as well as Mastodon and all the million other social media platforms right now. So that's kind of my advice, is like lean into curiosity, that we're supposed to, feel confident in our curiosity. And, you really are not alone in many of your struggles. It's true, again, with reliability and resilience outside of cybersecurity. It's a lot of people are wrestling with this stuff. So, it's almost like stop resisting, because like people want to help. Every software engineer I've talked to, like they are never trying to do the insecure thing. I mean, there are always like a few people that are weird, but for the most part, they are eager to help. They just don't know how. And they certainly don't want things that are going to ruin like their own promotion cycle and bonuses and things like that, like very gatekeepy obstructionist thing. So yeah, that's my thing. Like reach out, learn from these other disciplines, like apply that curiosity. And whenever you hear a kind of like us versus them thing, really question like, okay, what information am I missing? Maybe I should talk to the people that are the supposed them to really understand their perspective as well. So, but to your point, I don't think it's hopeless. I don't think we're stuck like this forever. And I'm not the only one, luckily, saying a lot of this stuff anymore. There are a lot of like InfoSec thought leaders and even institutions like CISA talking about secure by design. So I'm hoping that ends up trickling down as well.
Yeah, I mean, we just have to play a little nicer in the sandbox with non-security people. There's obviously comfort in being around your peers who do what you do every day, who understand your job, who, feel the same joys and pains. But, I think that's a really astute point, that to be actually successful, you have to get out of that comfort zone. And a lot of it really is just comfort zone, I think.
Yeah. And I think there is a human tendency with the like in-group, out-group bias, right? It can give your work more meaning if you do feel that us versus them mentality. To me, it should be very like an us versus like the cold, cruel world that disrupts our services and systems, and that includes attackers. I think that's the healthier us versus them. But like talk to any sort of like platform engineer. I'm sure when they're coming up, like I have a friend who I know like deleted the production database when they were an intern. I am pretty sure that there are very few cybersecurity people that have been through something quite that catastrophic by their own hand, right? Like hearing some of these stories, it's just, people have to be up like, 48 hours straight, like debugging some sort of, production performance failure because like the system is down. There are all sorts of failures that can go wrong. And it's like, we can learn from them, but it's also, again, like building that kind of like cross empathy, because I know the software engineers would love to hear about your kind of like, in the trenches stories as well. And I think that's one way to build the commonality, is kind of like being able to laugh together at the absurdity of the internet and the fact that there are things like attackers and there are things just like internet weather, as we call it at Fastly, and other like weird bugs and esoteric failures. And, like clocks are hard in distributed systems. Like distributed systems to me are so much harder than cybersecurity, but that's a topic for another time. So yeah, I think we're definitely not alone. And some of the challenges can be even harder outside of cybersecurity. So, find your comrades, basically.
So we've got a question here from some folks watching, and I've got my own theory. I think there's this narrative that security is somehow so unique and different from everything else that we've got to do everything from scratch and figure out everything from scratch, which is clearly not the case. But yeah, the question is, where is this stemming from cybersecurity folks? Does it have to do with their backgrounds, like you're saying, like and this used to be a tough question to ask. People have been asking me for 2 decades, where do I start to get into security? And my answers have changed over the years. But I've almost always said, like, to secure a thing, like you have to know how that thing works. So you have to do something on the tech side, and with all the tech stuff shifting now, I remember when I would go to AWS reInvent every year, and I would talk to organizations about how cloud and DevOps and all these changes are impacting their organization. They ended up with two different. IT was split into two. It was people who could make the shift to the new way of thinking, and people who couldn't. Kind of got split off into two separate groups. So yeah, just curious, you're like where's this gap coming from in cybersecurity in the first place? Not, maybe that helps us eliminate it, maybe not, but curious as to your thoughts.
I do think a lot of it is background because, like you said, a lot of people don't have that kind of systems knowledge. I actually don't think you need that much systems knowledge, like even a kind of cursory high level understanding of just like distributed systems, like understanding kind of, I would argue no one understands how Kubernetes actually works, but like a basic understanding of that, basic understanding again of just like what is a CI/CD pipeline. I know, again, I've taught a lot of security, just like here's how software kind of like gets delivered from when you're writing code. I feel like those kind of things are the basics to have in place. When I talk to security leaders, because I was trying to understand, much like you, like what's the holdup, right? Like what's wrong? A lot of it is fear, right? They're worried they're going to be obsolete because of this new world where everything, software is eating the world, right? You do have to understand how software works. And if you don't know how that works, if you came up because you were good at managing firewalls, which was like a very legit job back in the day, it's not so relevant anymore because you can push out like firewall configurations via things like infrastructure as code, and then managing other tools through like the GUI. It's just like those skills don't really matter. And frankly, the security strategy that people had with more of like the perimeter model, it's kind of obsolete in many ways. And so I think it's a very valid fear that like, I'm obsolete because my skills and my knowledge are obsolete. So therefore, I need to make sure the world stays in that same model that I have in my head of how it works. Like I need to restrict change because if the change happens, then maybe I'll be left behind. And I think it's very natural. It's a very natural human instinct to feel scared about that because, you have to feed yourself and your cats and loved ones, whoever else, right? So I think a lot of it is that kind of background and skill set. I also think, again, this kind of learned helplessness or defeatist attitude is I don't think it actually takes that much to learn. We saw this kind of thing you brought up, like splitting IT into. The example I give in my book is you never really hear about database administrators anymore, right? Used to be a huge population, not unlike InfoSec, and now they don't really exist. It's all been incorporated by DevOps. And for the most part, everybody used to say, oh, we have unique database needs. But for the most part, people really most organizations don't. And there are enough database options that you can kind of choose whatever meets your needs and you can have a few and their control plane, like all that good stuff, right? And I kind of feel like cybersecurity is similar, where right now it's like, yeah, everything has to be bespoke and everything. It's like, does it really have to be? Like, are we certain? And so I at least think that we'll see a similar shift from DBA to more of a DevOps model. To me, it's cybersecurity more to the platform engineering model, which obviously is related to a lot or incorporates a lot of DevOps practices. So.
Yeah, and one of my light bulb moments was talking to Ryan Huber when he was over at Slack, and he would say it's easier for me to hire an engineer, a software engineer, and teach them security than the other way around because that fundamental knowledge that they already have and that experience they already have.
Yeah, when I work with software engineering teams a lot, right? And I agree, it's actually pretty easy to teach them about cybersecurity. They get really excited doing things like building out decision trees. And especially once you get them thinking about like, how do we raise the cost of attack? And you make them think like, if you had a really bad day or like, if like your employer like treated you poorly, how would you disrupt system operation? Because that gets them also thinking about the access they already have, which then they're thinking about the same sort of mindset of like an attacker that steals developer credentials, right? Which we've seen that in a few incidents recently. Like if you just get them to think about what would make it harder or more expensive for you to disrupt the system, they kind of already they brainstorm solutions that are going to help in a meaningful way, like with the system's resilience against attack, right? Just to make it more expensive, to make it more tedious. A simple thing like implementing rate limiting on two-factor requests, right? Like the Uber breach, I think last year, where attacker basically like spammed a bunch of employees' phones with two-factor requests until someone was finally like, just please like stop it.
17 times. I think it was the 17th time they said yes.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's what human wouldn't do that, right? I think it's silly to blame the human in that scenario. So yeah, adding things like rate limiting, that's a solution that software engineers would think about. They would certainly think about things like, again, ephemerality, immutability. That's something they think about, again, with like, oh, the attacker can't pop a shell. They can't persist. Like they're going to have to like re-exploit the system. That's all very expensive and hard. And that's something, again, we probably want for reliability reasons. That's a pretty big win. And I am always amazed every time I do these kind of exercises with software engineers. There's so many things that I learn about where it's something, again, they're using for whatever reason, performance or just functionality. They're like, hey, actually, we could probably apply this to a cybersecurity use case and make it harder for attackers. And I just find that very beautiful. So I completely agree with Ryan's take that you don't have to do much in terms of teaching them about like how attackers work and think, to get them to understand like what's going to actually make a difference, and to get them thinking about especially things like secure by design, like embedding security by design in their platforms and systems.
Well, and humans are complex systems, right? Why would you? Yeah, why would you not plan for a human failing? That's something that always got me is humans are the weakest link kind of stuff. And my response to that is always no. The person who doesn't plan for the human failing is the weakest link. The person who thinks they can just send somebody, assign them security awareness training and somehow they're never going to make a mistake again. Like that's not how that works.
I know. Yeah, I feel like it was very unpopular when I was first kind of espousing those takes of like, listen, if like humans are still clicking on links after 2 decades, is it those people who are lazy and stupid or the people that are still surprised somehow that they're clicking on links? Like, let's be real. Like the joke I think I put on Twitter is like a meme from forever ago, where it's like, this is literally computers are a thing clicking machine and you're telling humans not to click things on the thing clicking machine. Like that's nonsensical. Like that's not a strategy. Yeah. That's like a prayer at best. Right. And I think there's a thing I introduced in the book called the ice cream cone hierarchy of security solutions, which is you want to scoop a bunch of resilience ice cream into the cone. So you need a big cone. The very base of the cone, the really flimsy, like horrible triangle that's just like drippy ice cream, is administrative controls. Those are things like policies like thou shalt not click the link, and things like awareness training, which I have always asked people when they say like, yeah, awareness training is great. I'm like, okay, can I see the studies? Because the studies I've seen show, yeah, it can maybe help for like a couple days, maybe a couple weeks.
Or more harm than good.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. And even Richard Thaler, who's a Nobel Prize laureate in economics, has talked about how phishing warnings are an example of sludge, which are basically like anti-patterns that you implement, that it's like adding unnecessary friction. Because the thing is, like I say with marketing people, right? They receive how many emails a day and what percentage of those are malicious? Like less than 1%. It is perfectly rational for them to click on things, and is completely irrational to base your security strategy around compelling them to not click on things. And like, to me, the problem is definitely, hey, we didn't design our security architecture assuming that the marketing person will click and open a PDF just like they do dozens of other times any given week, if not more. So yeah, that's a little tirade. But yeah, I think it's patently absurd that still in 2023, there's still cybersecurity people that are saying humans are the weakest link. We have to control human behavior. We have to get human brains to operate differently than they naturally do. It's like, no, we have to work with human behavior, not against it, or we will continue to fail. And again, it means that cybersecurity will be bypassed because the platform engineering teams will absolutely create, they're called like paved roads or other kind of like, again, making the easy way the secure way and cutting cybersecurity out because business has to get done. And increasingly, cybersecurity is at odds with that.
So a couple of things I think we have to hit before we run out of time here, Kelly. One of them, like we've been talking about platform engineering a lot, but honestly, my own understanding of platform engineering is probably lacking. So I want to hit that real quick, maybe a quick definition of that and what you're referring to when you say platform engineering.
Yeah, so I'm definitely relying on Camille Fournier, who I kind of view as like the OG or like the ultimate thought leader in this regard, because she's also like implemented it at her organizations. The long and short is basically you're treating internal systems like tools, whether that's developer tools or certainly again things like platforms, cybersecurity patterns. You're treating those as a product. So remember, you invited me to speak at B-Sides Knoxville ages ago, I feel like well over 5 years ago. And I talked about treating security as a product, where it's you have like user research in your user stories, you develop like your MVP, minimum viable product, you like actually try to solve pain points, and you treat it again like a product that is going to be delivered to users because you do have actual users. You can't just do things in isolation, right? You have to actually be solving a real user problem and building things the same way you build a product. So platform engineering is basically, I didn't know that term at the time, but it's basically, treating these tools like a product. So with cybersecurity, you certainly want to understand, for instance, if it's like, okay, we have the user problem of like developers need to ship code quickly, but they want to make sure that obviously there's not like some sort of cyber attack that ends up costing the business money or causes an outage and things like that, right? There are a bunch of different ways you can solve that. One of those ways is like having the developer having to open up a completely new window that's like some crappy Java app from 2006 that does vulnerability scanning that results in like 1,000 false positives, and the developer will hate you. That is a solution. But probably when you interview the developer, similar to like doing user research, you're going to realize like, oh, like developers really like flow state where they can like do their work efficiently and they're like in the zone. And so we don't want to disrupt that. We need to, at the minimum, if we do want to implement vulnerability scanning, we need to put it in line with their workflows, right? And this is something very different than I see a lot of cybersecurity organizations do, where they kind of just like buy tools without input from the stakeholders who are actually going to be interacting with the thing ultimately, which I think is personally just reprehensible and irresponsible. And I don't use those terms lightly. So platform engineering, it's like you conduct the user research, you understand their perspectives, you understand their workflows, you understand their goals and constraints, and you figure out how to best navigate that and solve that. And again, you create things like prototypes, you can do things like feature flagging, you have kind of like an iterative roadmap, you obviously get feedback from the users once it's implemented. They can try out a beta and give you feedback and you can refine it. But it becomes, again, a much different mindset than like, I buy the tools and you have to use them, and like, you're bequeathing it or kind of like forcing you into these workflows where we didn't actually give a shit about whether it was going to interrupt your work or disrupt you. That's kind of the traditional model. And this new model, platform engineering, is like, hey, like, we can't build this stuff in a box because you actually have to interact with it and use it. So we're going to get your input and we're going to take it seriously. And that's going to very much drive how we solve the problem.
And then the last thing I wanted to, is probably the last thing we have time for, but just where the rubber meets the road here in terms of, the chaos in the title of the book and the term chaos engineering. And this is something I've seen in a lot of cases. I mentioned my old experiences with disaster recovery and business continuity, where most of what can go wrong, you're not going to know about until you actually try it. Right. So I think this is a struggle for a lot of folks on how to use failure in a more controlled way to help improve resilience of their systems. Right. How do organizations achieve that? When in a lot of these organizations, they don't have any budget for test environments, even for doing proofs of concepts of new products they're looking at buying, which are probably not going to solve any of their problems anyway. So practically, how do they approach this? How do the SRE folks do it?
The SRE folks, I think it really depends. A lot of times, like you said, if they don't have a test or staging environment, it becomes hard. I honestly think part of what's held back the adoption is the term chaos. I definitely prefer the term resilient stress testing because that's what it is. You were stress testing the resilience of the system. I think it's slightly more grown up. Maybe it's not as hip, but there's a misconception that the goal is to cause chaos in production. And no, it's to make sure that we can fix things in production. This is something Aaron Reinhart definitely stresses, and something he did at United Health, is to make sure we can actually fix things. So on the SRE side, usually starting out in a staging environment is much healthier. writing the experiment, conducting the experiment is in some ways easier than the social stuff. I don't think we have time for me to get into all the social things that is in my book. I can definitely tell you, because I know, having been on the vendor side, how much some cybersecurity tools cost. This is going to be much less expensive, and it will actually show, if you want to talk about counterfactuals and being able to show like, hey, we, made sure that the business didn't, lose their shirt from this sort of attack. There wasn't a huge impact. Conducting a chaos experiment and showing like, hey, this would have been the impact if this had happened, and we've made this design change, ideally design change, to make sure that we either minimize the impact or minimize the hazards related to this thing. Like, that is a very tangible thing you can do to prove your program's value. So the way I think about it is the resilience stress testing is basically the scientific method applied to things like cybersecurity, or it could be reliability as well. So you're developing hypotheses. I love decision trees for those. You are then conducting experiments to validate or deny those hypotheses, and you're using that evidence to learn from failure and figure out how to make the system better. And you can start proving that out over time to prove that the system is more resilient to these types of failures over time. So importantly, again, you don't want to start in production. You don't want to overthink it. Use your hypotheses around really basic assumptions. Like the one Aaron did at United Health Group was like, our firewall will just detect and block misconfigured ports. A really basic assumption, right? What he found is that the firewall only worked like 60% of the time. So that assumption didn't actually hold up. So there are these really basic things that you can do for like control validation as well on the cybersecurity side to make sure that you are seeing the ROI of all the money you're spending. There's a great paper, I know this is long, but there was a great paper, I think 2 years ago now. It was an academic paper that measured the empirical efficacy of various EDR tools. And a lot of things they advertised that they did not do during this empirical assessment. So that's exactly what things like resilience stress tests can reveal. And you bet if you're a CISO, you can take that to your renewal or contract negotiation and be like, hey, you didn't actually help us with these failure scenarios. And that is a very powerful thing that can definitely save you money. So I personally dislike there isn't any money. There's certainly, again, social finessing that has to happen, but it is possible. I mean, I even know a company that has self-serve chaos tests where it's just part of their like CI/CD workflow. You can just like be like, yeah, I want to like select from this menu of chaos experiments to run on like my new changes or new service. So it's definitely possible. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think that's all we have time for. There's so many other things we could dive into here, but we've linked Deciduous, your decision tree app, in the show notes, and your book in the show notes here. The book is very readable. I've been, to prepare for this conversation, I've been reading through it. I find the format very useful, and tons of examples too. And I think that's what's missing from a lot of books is actual examples that you can learn from. And yeah, this was great. Thank you, Kelly.
No, thank you. Great questions and a pleasure as always.
All right, we'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly enterprise news, and Mr. Tyler Shields will be joining us.